In 2009, an anonymous military technician was recruited for routine electromagnetic research in Antarctica, but what he discovered beneath the ice would shatter everything we think we know about our world. Ancient structures older than human civilization, portals to other dimensions that defy explanation, and an alleged leaked audio recording of the containment breach. What he reveals about what's really happening in Antarctica will make you realize we're all living a lie.
Secrets of the Woods.
This message comes from someone who reached out and demanded anonymity. He said he found your YouTube channel a few months ago and had been deliberating ever since whether to share what he knows. He finally sent this to me, and I'm passing it along as is. I'll just refer to him as the witness, since he didn't want his real name or any rank mentioned. He clearly stated he's scared, even though he's been out of service for years. But he can't carry this secret any longer. According to him, the events took place at a classified base somewhere deep in Antarctica. Not the typical McMurdo station, or even the smaller research hubs people hear about. He described a place beneath the ice, a structure so vast it made him question everything he'd ever been told about Antarctica, and for that matter, the planet itself. He wrote it all in a hurried, almost frantic style, but I'll try to convey it accurately. This is what he said. He'd been recruited into the military straight out of an advanced technical school around 2009. He didn't say exactly where he studied, only that his field was specialized, something to do with electromagnetic systems. He was told initially that his assignment might involve cold weather testing or potentially working at a research facility in the Arctic or Antarctic regions. Nothing too out of the ordinary for specialized training, but definitely a unique environment. He was shipped to Christchurch, New Zealand, which, as you know, is a common stop-off point for folks heading to McMurdo. Then, from Christchurch, he was taken on one of those usual flights on a C-17 to the ice. This is where his story starts to get weird. He never arrived at McMurdo. He was met by a separate group of men. He called them Men in Gray, for lack of a better term, who loaded him, 2 other new arrivals, plus a few crates of equipment, onto a smaller plane. This smaller plane had no identifiable markings, which he found odd. It flew for hours in what felt like a continuous southwestern direction from McMurdo. He recalled being told not to look out the windows, which he found immediately suspicious. He glanced anyway, whenever he thought no one was watching. He said the sky was crystal clear in patches, beautiful in that stark Antarctic way, but in other areas, it looked as if there was a haze or some atmospheric disturbance. After several hours, the plane started a slow descent. He expected to see a runway or an outpost, but all he saw was endless ice and the slightest indication of a steep mountainous region in the distance. Then, without warning, they began descending rapidly, as if dropping into an unseen valley or crevasse. The next thing he knew, the plane hovered for a moment near an opening in the ice. Hovered might be the wrong word. He insisted it felt like the plane just dropped straight down, which was impossible for a normal craft of that size. One moment, they were in midair. The next, they were inside an enormous cavern of solid ice. When he stepped off the plane, the first thing he noticed was the temperature. It was still cold, but definitely warmer than the Antarctic surface. That alone confused him. He was immediately escorted by these men in gray. some of whom seemed to have no insignia, badges, or even name tags, down a corridor that appeared to have been carved out of the ice, but reinforced with steel and concrete along the walls and ceiling. They walked for at least 15 minutes, passing multiple security checkpoints, each manned by personnel in different uniforms. Some looked like standard US military. He recognized the gear and insignia, but others wore uniforms he didn't recognize at all. Some with patches depicting flags of countries that supposedly had minimal presence in Antarctica. There were Russians there, also Chinese, and even uniforms with patches he said he didn't recognize from any known country. When he tried to make sense of it, he was told they were Allied specialists, which was about as vague as it gets. Eventually, he and the others were separated, each taken to what looked like an orientation room. He remembered the first official briefing he received. It was from a man in a crisp uniform, stating that this facility was part of a multinational collaboration to conduct frontier research. But that's all the man would say. Then, the witness was given a form about 10 pages long that basically served as a more stringent non-disclosure agreement than anything he'd seen before. It mentioned, in bold lettering, that any breach of secrecy regarding this project and the facility's purpose would be considered an act of treason. The document referenced legal code from multiple nations, not just the United States. He said he'd never seen anything like it. He wasn't even sure how that would hold up in court, but the message was clear. Keep your mouth shut, or you disappear. Over the next few days, he was introduced to the routine of the base. He said it was surprisingly large, with multiple levels going deeper under the ice. Hallways branched off in directions that made it easy to get lost if you didn't know your way. He needed a special ID card with a microchip to access certain levels, and there were guards everywhere. Most of the staff he encountered seemed normal enough. Scientists, engineers, a few officers who clearly had a hierarchical structure among them. But everyone was on edge. People didn't make casual conversation. He could sense there was a blanket of tension. If you asked questions, you either got a vague brush-off or a direct order to not ask again. It was about a week into his stay that he started hearing whispers about the gateways. He overheard a couple of scientists talking about scheduling issues with the gateway unit, mentioning that it needed a new power supply or some sort of recalibration. Another time, he passed a door with a thick security lock and heard what sounded like mechanical humming from behind it. He didn't think much of it at first, just more equipment. But the more he heard the word gateway, the more he became curious. He tried to ask one of the engineers he'd become friendly with, but the moment he mentioned gateway, the engineer's face went white, and he told the witness to never bring it up again unless he wanted to vanish. That's when he realized how serious this was. Disturbingly, someone else reached out to me that seemed to have a connection with this strange report. While the conversation was brief, it revealed there is more truth to this than we realize.
Well, what his story, it's not crazy. So I was in logistics back around 2010, 2011, and I was working out of Christchurch, New Zealand. At the time, I handled shipments for the ice. I'm not talking about usual McMurdo runs, science gear, food, normal stuff. And this was next level stuff. You had sealed manifests, just codes and weights, and orders came from way above my level, and we'd load crates onto C-17s or smaller planes with no markings. That was obviously way above my clearance level, but one time I saw these guys in gray suits that he was talking about. They were actually around one of the checkpoints for a period while I was working. They really rubbed me the wrong way, but I wasn't allowed to do or say anything. So And one loadmaster told me, he saw, ice cliffs open up like a hangar door, and they dropped right in. I processed gear that didn't add up. Big electromagnetic coils, strange power units, nothing you'd use for weather stations. Security was pretty insane. There were multiple occasions we had armed escorts, and not just U.S. Russian Chinese patches on some uniforms. Obviously, I can't validate everything he wrote because I never saw gateways or anything like that, but we were definitely shipping stuff for something massive they didn't want anyone figuring out.
Around this time, he also learned that the entire base was not entirely man-made. Parts of it, especially in the deeper levels, were of unknown origin. Tunnels that had evidently been there long before any modern humans set foot on Antarctica. He overheard some folks referencing ancient structures or pre-Adamite ruins, but no one seemed to want to elaborate. He would walk by certain corridors and see that the walls were not the polished steel of a lab, nor the iced-over rock of typical Antarctic subterranean cavities. Instead, these walls looked like they had inscriptions or some sort of patterns etched into them, patterns that defied normal geometry. He once caught a glimpse of symbols that reminded him of cuneiform or hieroglyphics, but not quite any known language. Again, no answers were given, just hush-hush. It was roughly a month into his assignment when he was brought into a new detail. He had been working with some form of electromagnetic scanning equipment. He mentioned he was part of a team that checked for certain frequency anomalies along the base's perimeter. One afternoon, he was called to meet with a high-ranking official. He refused to mention the exact rank or name, fearing it might narrow down his identity too much, who told him that his clearance was being elevated for a special project. He was given a manila folder containing a summary of objectives. Calibrate a device that monitored dimensional stability in something called Chamber 6. That's when he started to piece together that there was more than just a gateway. There were multiple chambers, and each apparently served a different function. Chamber 6 was evidently a key area, possibly one of those places that wasn't fully man-made. He found himself escorted deeper than he'd ever been before, down multiple elevator shafts that required both a card scan and a retinal scan. Each time the elevator opened, the corridors became less like a military installation and more like a combination of modern technology grafted onto ancient stone. He described it as if the ice had been excavated around some archaic structure, and the military just built around that. The lighting was dimmer, with overhead fixtures spaced out. Guards stood at every juncture. He was taken to a room that was labeled with a simple 6 on a metal plaque, but the door behind that plaque was definitely older, carved with strange markings. Inside was a large dome-like chamber. The ceiling arched at least 30 feet high, with walls that curved in a perfect, smooth formation. It reminded him of the interior of a sphere cut in half. At the center stood a ring-like apparatus, about 7 feet tall. This ring was surrounded by some kind of scaffolding or platform with wiring snaking all around it. He noticed an array of computers and monitors off to one side. Several technicians were busy typing commands, analyzing data. The ring, he called it a portal ring, hummed softly. It had an almost liquid sheen to it, though it was clearly metallic. He was then shown the interface that controlled the electromagnetic frequencies. His job: help maintain a stable field around that ring. Something about ensuring the portal coordinates or interdimensional alignment, words he never thought he'd hear outside of science fiction, remained constant. He said it was absolutely surreal. It felt more like a dream or a movie set. Yet the fear and tension in the room was real enough, reminding him that this was serious. People looked anxious, like they were working with a bomb that could go off any second. He didn't see the device in operation right away. His initial assignment was to run diagnostic checks. He'd read the electromagnetic patterns while the technicians tested small power feeds to the ring. Each time they fed power into it, the ring glowed faintly, and he felt the static in the air. Then they'd dial it back down. Over the course of a week, he gathered enough data to realize that the ring's readings spiked in certain resonant frequencies that didn't match anything in known physics, at least known to him. He saw waveforms that seemed to fluctuate in more than 3 dimensions, if that makes any sense. He could only describe it as if the ring was reaching into something else, or something else was trying to come through. Eventually, he was present for what they called a test transit. He wasn't allowed to see who or what went through, but he was there for the lead-up. The ring powered up, the humming grew louder, and a shimmering field appeared in the center, looking somewhat like heat mirage, only more defined, like a swirl. He caught glimpses of something beyond the swirl. He couldn't describe it properly, just that it didn't look like any part of the chamber on the other side. The ring stabilized for about a minute, and then the field disappeared. This was apparently a success. He overheard a conversation about how the subject, he assumed a human test subject or possibly a drone, had successfully passed through to the other side, though he never got confirmation on what the other side was. He just knew it wasn't anywhere on Earth that we commonly know. That alone would have been shocking enough. But the bigger bombshell came when he realized what he called beyond Antarctica. He had always heard rumors, conspiracy stuff about an ice wall, secret expansions beyond the continent, hidden realms the governments didn't want us to see. He heard references to the rest of the domain. People openly talked about how Antarctica was more than just a polar continent. They insinuated that if one traveled far enough beyond certain latitudes, or knew exactly where to go, you'd come to areas that exist outside of what we consider normal Earth boundaries. Some used the phrase other planes of existence, while others talked about it more as if it were just regions of Earth that were kept hidden. He said it was the first time he genuinely felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sub-zero climate. He realized that the facility was not only about harnessing or studying alien or interdimensional technology. It was about controlling access to a hidden realm beyond the conventional map of Antarctica. He started noticing more references to the ice wall, as if it were a real barrier that not only physically barred entry, but also somehow manipulated perception. Something about massive electromagnetic illusions that made it impossible for the average traveler or pilot to see what lay beyond. He recounted hearing a rumor that Admiral Byrd back in the late 1940s encountered phenomena that contradicted official geography, and that Operation High Jump was partially about mapping and controlling whatever was out there. One day, while grabbing a coffee in a break area, he overheard 2 men in low voices discussing the potential expansion of the base, implying that the current subterranean complex was just a fraction of what existed deeper under the ice. They mentioned huge caverns and even entire networks that led to open expanses that were not freezing. They spoke about lush areas hidden under miles of ice, warmed by geothermal vents or something more exotic. They argued quietly about how certain creatures, yes, creatures, had been spotted down there, and that the base's security teams occasionally had to do containment missions. He tried to glean more information but was spotted eavesdropping and told to move on. It was clear that was a restricted conversation. He then recounted a terrifying moment where a coworker, an electrical engineer, went missing for a few days. When the engineer returned, he was ghostly pale and wouldn't speak to anyone. Everyone suspected he'd seen something or been taken to a different section of the base. The witness tried to ask him what happened, but the engineer just shook his head and indicated that if he spoke, his family would be in danger. This was the atmosphere in the base: fear, secrecy, and an underlying dread that something bigger and more ominous was at play. Over time, the witness became more entangled in the portal project. He was one of the few who could operate the frequency monitoring equipment reliably. This gave him a vantage point that others didn't have. He'd see the readings from each activation, and he realized the base was regularly sending people or equipment through these gateways. He never got to see them return. He wondered if the return gateway was somewhere else in the complex, or maybe somewhere else entirely. He also knew that some of these missions went beyond what we define as Earth, because he saw logs referencing other designations that sounded planetary or dimensional in nature. He also saw references to something called Project Jumpseat. He guessed it was the code name for using these portals as a means of instant travel to other realms, or maybe even off-planet. The witness grew uneasy, to put it mildly. The more he learned, the less comfortable he felt. He heard secondhand stories of entities that might have come through. He mentioned one incident where the chamber had to be put on lockdown because something had apparently arrived unannounced. Alarms went off, strobe lights flashed, and heavily armed soldiers rushed in. The witness was barricaded behind a blast door. He didn't see the entity, but he heard what he described as a high-pitched, eerie vibrating sound that didn't feel earthly. After the incident was contained, the base resumed normal operations, but the tension was at an all-time high. Some staff were transferred out, others just disappeared. No official explanation was given. He also started hearing more talk about what lay beyond the ice wall physically. He gleaned that a portion of the base extended out to an area where the ice ends abruptly, not in the sense of a coastline, but a boundary that transitions into a zone the government wants to remain unseen. He overheard a colonel mention something about that infinite stretch out there, and how it's protected by illusions and our advanced tech. Another scientist talked about historical expeditions that supposedly found entire civilizations beyond Antarctica. Some said these civilizations were remnants of ancient breakaway societies. Others believed they were from a time before the last ice age, and still others insisted they were not human at all. The witness couldn't verify any of this. He only had scraps of conversations and rumors. But the fervor with which people guarded these secrets told him there was some truth to it. He recounted a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. Two senior officials discussed the possibility that Earth, as we commonly understand it, is only one section of a much larger plane. They lamented that the masses would never accept such an idea, nor could they be allowed to know it, because it would dissolve national borders, religions, and basically upend every aspect of modern society. One of them apparently said something like, "We're just guardians of the gateway until the time is right, or until they decide otherwise." The witness never found out who they referred to, whether it meant some higher Earth authority or something not from Earth. He noticed that people who asked too many questions started receiving warnings. One day, he found an envelope slipped under his door with a single piece of paper that said, "Don't dig." He confided in a coworker who told him that they all get that note if they poke around too much. That coworker later vanished without a trace. This only heightened the witness's paranoia. He resolved to do his job as robotically as possible, hoping to avoid stepping on any toes. Still, the horrors he glimpsed, both in the daily logs of the portal chamber and the few times he saw strange cargo loaded onto unmarked vehicles, convinced him he needed to find a way out. During his second year at the base, he was approached by a man he'd never seen before, wearing a black suit rather than a military uniform. The man told him he was part of a special division, tasked with ensuring compliance and security. He made it clear that the witness's expertise was valued, but also made it clear that if he ever divulged anything about the base or its operations, the repercussions would be severe. The man also told him that due to his increasing familiarity with extra-dimensional protocols, he might be asked to do a longer tour at the facility. The witness felt cornered, like there was no escape. Eventually, his saving grace came when he had a mild medical issue, kidney stones, that required treatment outside of the base's limited medical facility. He was temporarily shipped back to a standard Antarctic station near the main American science outposts. During that transit, he realized this might be his only chance to slip away from the program. He was told to return to duty once he recovered, but he never did. Instead, he managed to fly back to the US, blending in with ordinary travelers. He started the process of quietly resigning from the military, feigning mental health issues. Surprisingly, his discharge was processed without major incident, possibly because they believed no one would take him seriously if he ever opened his mouth. Or maybe they had bigger issues to deal with. From that point on, he lived under the radar. He changed addresses frequently, worked odd jobs, and never told anyone about his Antarctic experience. He also said he was regularly followed by suspicious individuals. He'd see the same faces in different towns, men in dark clothing watching him from across the street. He never confronted them. He just tried to be as invisible as possible. He decided to reach out to your YouTube channel after stumbling on some episodes where people talked about hidden bases, government cover-ups, and advanced portals. He recognized fragments of truth in what was being discussed. He said he realized that his account might add to the puzzle even if it put him at risk. He strongly believes the public has a right to know about these secret programs in Antarctica, about the existence of gateways, and about the bigger reality that's being concealed. He didn't mention aliens directly, but he implied that some of the technology and maybe some of the entities involved are not human. He also insisted that the concept of an ice wall is not just conspiracy talk. There is a real boundary, guarded by illusions or advanced electromagnetic fields, to prevent explorers from discovering what lies beyond. He recalled hearing about a group of scientists who tried to break protocol and explore beyond the official boundaries, only to have their expedition forcibly stopped by a joint task force. Some of them were never seen again. This event was apparently hushed up as a tragic accident or a whiteout that took their lives. The witness believes they were either detained or worse. He also mentioned that the entire operation down there is not strictly American. Yes, the US has a big role, but so do other major powers, and even some smaller nations with advanced technology programs. The secrecy is airtight, enforced by threats that transcend borders. It's like a hidden alliance that overrides any public policies or treaties we know about. As he wrote more, he became increasingly anxious. You could feel it in his words. He said that telling this truth is a double-edged sword. He wants people to be aware, but he also fears the ramifications. He's certain that if certain agencies discover his identity, he'll either be discredited as mentally unwell or simply made to disappear. He's seen it happen to others who tried to speak out. He mentioned a soldier who once confided in a friend about seeing reptilian-like creatures in the deeper caverns. That soldier was suddenly flown out for psychological evaluations and never returned. Officially, he was honorably discharged, but no one ever heard from him again. Whether that was voluntary or forced, no one knows. The witness also touched on a bizarre rumor circulating within the base, that some of these other planes of existence accessible via the gateway aren't just random parallel worlds. He heard talk of coordinates that led to realms once described in ancient mythologies, places like Agartha or Shambhala, or references to the Hollow Earth. He was never sure if that was just a nickname, or if the people truly believed they were traveling to those legendary locales, but the conversations were always hushed, as if referencing them was taboo even among those with clearance. He got the distinct impression that some missions were more spiritual or esoteric in nature, possibly involving contact with beings who had knowledge or power well beyond human understanding. He noted that morale at the base was low, with many people suffering from insomnia or psychological stress. There were reports of breakdowns. The official story was always seasonal affective disorder, or the stress of living in a harsh polar environment. But the witness suspected the real cause was the unnatural environment and the knowledge that they were dabbling in forces beyond comprehension. He claimed that more than once, while performing routine checks, he felt an overpowering presence watching him. It wasn't just the guards. It felt non-human, like some entity lurking beyond the dimensional veil. A few other technicians reported similar feelings: sudden chills, footsteps echoing in corridors that were supposed to be empty, a sense of being stared at from corners of the base that were in darkness. During one particularly unsettling shift, the witness heard an alarm ring in a rarely accessed lower level. He and two other technicians rushed to see what was happening. They found the corridor sealed by heavy blast doors. Red lights flashed, and they heard faint screams, then silence. Half an hour later, the alarm was canceled, and a stern officer told them to forget what they heard. When they pressed for answers, they were threatened with immediate disciplinary action. Later, a scientist whispered that something got loose from one of the portals, but no official explanation was ever given. The corridor reopened a few days later, as if nothing had happened. People should be careful if they ever plan to investigate Antarctica. The official tours and research stations are just window dressing. The real stuff happens behind sealed doors, in places no civilian can reach without top-tier clearance. If you go snooping, you'll likely be detained or worse, and your disappearance will be explained as an accident, the easiest cover story in that extreme environment. He said that the biggest lie is that Antarctica is just a frozen wasteland with a few penguins and some scattered research stations. In reality, it's the linchpin of a massive cover-up, the gateway to something far more expansive than the world we know. The official treaties, the heavily restricted air routes, the limited maritime access, all are part of ensuring that prying eyes never see what's really there. And for those who do see it, well, they either become part of the system or vanish. He wanted to mention one last detail. There's a rumored extension of the base that leads to a massive structure referred to internally as the dome. He never got to see it, but he heard it was a spherical chamber of unknown origin, possibly older than human civilization. The dome is where the real key to the Gateway network resides, possibly some ancient power source or control panel. If we're dealing with something truly ancient and not of this earth, who knows what it's capable of?
If you guys enjoyed today's stories, be sure to smack that like and subscribe button so you don't ever miss another episode of Secrets of the Woods. I'll see you all in the next episode.